I am becoming increasingly convinced that Liz Truss will be able to make a comeback at some point in the future. Like I say, you do not go on all these very public speaking sector circuits making all this noise that I was right, everything I was doing was right and correct. It was just those anti-growth people who refused to get behind me, even though it was most of a party that wanted her gone, because, as we said, her plans and these plans of these free market fundamentalists who don't really, shall we say, engage in proper economics, they engage in economic fantasy. They engage in their ideals that our Austrian economic model says that if we do this, we will then prosper. Now, I've said a number of times, I really, really need to go over what happened because of the big Crystal Palace, the world's first exhibition, why that was created, and of course, the free market fundamentalists back in the Victorian age that, well, convinced Prince Albert to try and back this grand economic experiment with the UK in reducing all its tariffs to zero. Like I say, this grand economic experiment lasted 6 years before the farmers of the UK at the time said, this isn't working because we can't sell our goods because all this cheap corn is coming in from America. We just can't compete against it. Like I say, lasted 6 years. And a lot of these very similar arguments economically are the exact same economic arguments that we are about to hear today and have been made by the Brexiteers and people like Liz Truss time and time again. So we're going to go indulge and see some economic fantasy by, of course, one John Littleworth. He was, of course, a former Brexit Party MEP. So, of course, he's a Brexit economic fantasist as well, trying to say that the UK needs to just completely ditch all of its regulation completely. And once again, everything will be all fine and miraculous. So let's get diving into this then, shall we? But before we do that, as always, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. Of course, there is the YouTube thank you button as well. And of course, there is the Pony Club down below as well. And remember, it is Wednesday today, so both the Patreon members and the Pony Clubbers will be getting a new video. And of course, if you have subscribed to that, you will be getting access to all the other videos that we've made now just for you guys. So let's crack on into this then. So, as always, this comes from, well, the most best comedy website online, Conservative Home, with the title of "Only through deregulating from the EU can we unleash the innovation Britain needs." And once again, we'll always say, look, if you want to deregulate, deregulate, then essentially what that means is that you put up more trade barriers with our biggest trading partner. We are already experiencing a lot of pain and a lot of friction and a lot of disruption to supply lines from the basic quads that have already been put in place of Brexit. And now these guys want to really push for deregulation even further. But as you will see here, doesn't actually say what regulations he wants to get rid of, which is, again, of course, the old free market fundamentalist classic of, we won't tell you about what regulation we want to get rid of, just that we want to get rid of all these regulation because it's bad. It's bad for innovation. We need to do that to unleash Britain. It's Britannia unleashed all over again. But let's go on into this. So, the government's abandoned its previous plan to sunset EU laws by the end of the year has caused considerable political consternation. This is not surprising in the context of the parliamentary process, but least so in respect of the practical benefit to businesses and the economy. There would be no practical benefits to businesses and the economy if we were going to say at the end of the year that that's it, any EU regulation gone. Because as we've said multiple times before when we've covered this. A lot of our laws and our own rules and regulations are built atop of these EU laws. We have expanded on some of these regulations. And the thing is I've always described it, is it would be like if you are building a house and then you suddenly went, I want to change the foundations. But you've already built the full house. if you're just suddenly gonna whip out the foundations, that's gonna cause an awful lot of problems. And that's the problem of what these free market fundamentalists want to do. They're literally pulling out the foundations of a lot of laws, which would cause massive legal black holes, because all of a sudden, part of this law or this regulation that is referring to just no longer exists. It would be absolute disaster and catastrophe just waiting to happen. And yet, that would be, quote, a practical benefit to businesses in the economy. Anyway, back to it. So, sunsetting what was to be known in the business as the burning platform. This meant that it would force action, as otherwise legislation would disappear. However, in practice, it was likely to lead to the retention of much of the law, with Whitehall on the go slow and ministers unwilling or unable to drive deregulation in their departments. It was unlikely in practice to produce meaningful results. Then, if you are obsessed with this massive deregulation and you know that a lot of this laws are going to be retained, because again, I've said, if you were to do this massive bonfire, it would lead to massive legal black holes and massive amounts of uncertainty about, well, what does this mean? Because we've got part of a law, but the other half is just completely gone. So what does that mean? And of course, as we've said before, the EU would reciprocate. The idea that the EU would just stand back and do nothing as we just burned up every single piece of law is complete folly. But there you go. So it is perhaps refreshing and pragmatic that Kimmy Badenoch, the Secretary of State responsible to, quote, bite the bullet and went for a different approach, given the realpolitik that she faced, even if it itself will result in a failure of ministers across the board. So, again, trying to protect his fellow Brexiteer in that regard, because a lot of the Brexiteers, as we said very recently, were not happy with Kimmy Badenoch. In fact, a lot of people have said that Kimmy Badenoch has pretty much no chance now in the future of ever becoming leader of the Conservative Party, which she wanted to do. But if she's losing and cracking under the pressure that she's facing as business secretary already, then how is she going to face under the spotlight of being prime minister? I do not think she would last long given that pressure. And you're already seeing, remember, Rishi Sunak, he's already cracking very much under the pressure of being prime minister. So we'll see how long he lasts, but there you go. So the real test now, or however, is what happens next. The removal of these 600 minor and redundant regulations does not constitute deregulation. For this reason, the Independent Business Network, which represents family businesses, and 85% of businesses in the UK are family owned or run, has produced a major report on what to do next on the deregulation of retained EU law. It sets out specific actions required of meaningful deregulation across 100 retained EU laws and argues for a common law framework. So, first of all, what do you mean by a common law framework? Do you mean that we need to relook and bring those retained EU laws into UK law? What do you mean by bring them into a common law framework? That seems to me just like a complete load of jargon, but who knows? Maybe I'll explain it later on in the article. To be honest, given these deregulatory, uh, well, maniacs, they do not like to explain what they want to do because, well, a lot of people suddenly disagree when they are explaining that, hey, all those workers' rights that you've got, well, yeah, we sort of want to get rid of them. But once again, so far, oh yes, just 100 pieces of deregulation that we want to do. So far, not mentioned one piece of regulation. There are those who, of course, argue that we must align with the EU. They are barking up the wrong tree. Only 8% of businesses export to the EU. That's not true. I'm pretty sure that is not true, that only 8% of businesses export to the EU, considering that they are our second, or well, they are one of our largest business trading partners. That is not true. It represents just 12% and a falling percentage of the economy. By contrast, 18% of the economy is trading with the rest of the world, and a whopping 70% is domestic. So, yeah, of course, I think that's gone up in recent times. But this idea that 18% of the economy is trading with the rest of the world, technically now, the rest of the world includes the EU. So I don't really, 100% again, agree with this guy's statistics. I don't know where he's getting them from, but I'm willing to say that those statistics may be very wrong. I'm willing to be proven otherwise, but I think those statistics he's given out are very, very wrong. Because, like I say, when you look at a lot of businesses that do export, over 40% of our trade was done with the EU. And when you break it down, as we said, into individual industries, well, then that's where you see 70%, 80%, 60% trade with the EU. I don't believe those figures that he's quoted. It is the latter where this productivity and growth would have a dramatic effect. Open trade will help by lifting the regulatory and tax burdens as essential. Uh, the dynamic alignment with the EU and retention of existing law is convenient for those businesses who wish to export to the EU, but it will drag an anchor on those who do not. Well, what if you then want to trade with the EU? Because that opens the door for you to be able to do that. If we align and let's say for steel, for example, I know there's tariffs involved in it, but let's just say for the sake of argument, just to keep it simple. I know actually glass. Let's go with glass. Let's say you want to send a glass product or literally a glass into the EU. You want to set a set of glasses like that. Well, if you sign alignment deals and etc., well, all of a sudden we might get to the point where the EU goes, well, if it's that product, you don't have to do any paperwork for it. Are you telling me that a business who, quote, does not trade with the EU would suddenly not want to do trade with the EU because the barriers that were now that have been put up are now suddenly gone? There is now a door that they can walk through and open and start trading with the EU. Are you seriously going to say that businesses aren't going to start taking advantage of that alignment? Because they seem to do quite a lot when we're in the EU, but oh, so it would be a drag anchor on those who do not. It makes no sense unless it is politically motivated to facilitate easy re-entry into the EU or to soothe an aggressive continental neighbor for fear of retaliation. And bear in mind, if we deregulate, the EU will retaliate. This idea that the EU will just sit by and do nothing is false. But also, what about these trade deals that we've just signed with, Australia and all these other countries? Do you think they're suddenly going to be silent as well? No, no, they are absolutely not. So once again, this idea that, oh, we can do whatever we want in our economy is, once again, it's a very much a Brexiteer fantasy, because other countries will have a say, especially if you've got a trade agreement with them. But there you go. So the idea of re-entry is a pipe dream. It's absolutely not a pipe dream. It's, I think, a lot easier and a lot closer in reality than a lot of people really do believe. Even if people confuse the sorry state of the nation somehow with Brexit, it has a lot to do with Brexit, even though people like you like to say it's not, but there you go. An attempt at re-entry would run into harsh realities that would require public sentiment would soon change. It would probably not. In the meantime, we are missing the massive opportunities for growth through divergence, which is the worst of all worlds. Change has to come, and if it were to be done, it best be done quickly. So, once again, what are these opportunities? What do you want to do with divergence? And of course, what does this mean when you do diverge? Because again, the idea that if you diverge, what exactly do you want to diverge from? What laws do you want to change? Again, if you are talking about this, you need to actually talk about these laws that you want to change. And so far, he's not doing that. Deregulation matters. But again, what are you deregulating? If it matters, why aren't you saying what you want to deregulate? The impacts can be analyzed to death, especially by those who wish to frustrate it. You mean talking about the impacts of the deregulation that you would want to do? Lifting the bureaucratic barriers on businesses frees up resources, improves productivity, and encourages risk taking and investment. Though through these things, it facilitates growth. Again, this whole idea of, oh, you don't understand, businesses are under too much pressure. This regulation, it stifles innovation. Well, I don't believe that, because we've had a lot of innovation from businesses. Businesses are innovating constantly. It is the cry of these free market fundamentalists to try and convince people, oh, you don't understand. We can't take risks. Businesses can take risks. There's nothing saying that businesses can't take risks now. Improving productivity, businesses could do a lot to improve their own productivity. For example, a 4-day week. We have seen numerous examples throughout the world, even in studies done in the UK, of where they've brought in a 4-day week and it has improved productivity. There's nothing stopping a business bringing in a 4-day week. There's all this stuff that businesses can do. And yet, according to him, oh no, we can't do it, deregulation. A lot of what this guy really would love to do, and it means improving productivity, it means to him removing the EU Working Time Directive, because my employees can only work so long before they would have to do overtime. And back in the good old days, we could force them to work overtime. Now, with, again, the EU Working Time Directive, bosses cannot force you to work overtime. They can ask you to work overtime, but you have the right to refuse. And of course, they have no, and of course, they cannot come back on you and fire you or anything like that. Again, back in the good old days, they could. And that's what this guy is talking about when it comes to deregulation. That is what this guy ultimately wants. But of course, he isn't talking about the actual regulations that he wants to take away. It is the same thing that we see time and time again when we see these free market fundamentalists talk about deregulation. They talk about, oh, how deregulation matters so much to them, how it would improve all this productivity and it would encourage risk taking. But okay, what exactly do you want to deregulate? What exactly do you want to diverge from? What are those specific rules and regulations? And that is where they will not talk about it. So, back to it. So, this is practically true for micro, small, and medium-sized businesses who have limited resources to deal with red tape and for whom the amount of administration and bureaucracy can be overwhelming. You have just put a mountain of red tape on them because of Brexit. If you were a small business and you traded with the EU prior to Brexit, well, now you've got a mountain of paperwork to do. This is why we have seen thousands of small businesses and medium-sized businesses just give up on exporting altogether. Even some have gone, it's not even worth the hassle of importing either, because it's now even more difficult. And when you've got businesses that are like that, that spells trouble for your economy. It spells very, very big trouble, considering this guy loves growth. It is by only allowing innovation, creative disruption, and enterprise that will grow that can take place. Again, the idea that innovation, creative disruption, and enterprise are not taking place at this current moment is false. Again, he's trying to set up this false picture to try and sell deregulation. That only if we didn't have these deregulations, then only will true creativity take roots. Well, guess what? There are these other countries that do not have these deregulations. But we don't see them innovating and all this stuff. Instead, what we see is massive exploitation of the workers that these businesses have. That's what we see instead. So, economic growth is vital for the people of Britain. It generates the wealth that we need to pay for all our public services, and we want to support real income growth. Without it, slowly over time, we'll become a backwater, unable to provide for our security, falling behind technology, and unable to buy decent food, take holidays, enjoy the best healthcare, or afford to keep ourselves warm. So, if you do not want us to be a backwater, why then did we do Brexit? Because Brexit ultimately is a number one reason for a lot of those. If implemented in full, the body of deregulation proposed will save billions of pounds to boost the economy. Once again, he hasn't talked about any of the things he actually wants to deregulate. And think of this. If a measure requires a person earning £15 an hour to implement, and they have to spend just 3 hours doing it a year across 4 million businesses, this adds up to £180 million per annum. There are hundreds of regulations for which cost much more time and capital investment. Furthermore, it frees up time for enterprises, innovation, and the lifeblood of the economy. So bear that in mind. If a measure requires a person earning £15 an hour to implement, and they have to spend just 3 hours doing it across a 4 million businesses, well, not even that, just that one business. This is exports. This is exporting. And bear in mind, what is this guy who's earning £15 an hour implementing? Is it health and safety regulations? Is it working time directive? Is what is it exactly this guy's meant to be implementing? Because oh yeah, it costs these 4 million businesses over £180 million a year. But what exactly is he implementing? And once again, it all comes back to these free market fundamentalists, these deregulatory maniacs, don't want to actually talk about what it is they want to deregulate. Instead, they talk all these big words and oh my god, if we did this would be fantastic. It's exactly the same way they talked about Brexit. So if you are someone who voted for Brexit, seeing this, and luckily, if you actually read the comments of this article, the vast majority of people are calling out on this, saying how important regulations are and that you shouldn't be doing this. And hey, what exactly do you want to deregulate? So at least I'm glad that there are at least conservatives recognizing the importance of regulation, because this is something that post Brexit, I think a lot of people in the UK are going to realize the importance of regulations. Because I still think at the moment, people haven't realized that importance, and we still not have seen any real significant regulation go through Parliament yet. Especially if it would be something that would be, popular, like a popular form of regulation, like be it in something like workers' rights or something else. We haven't seen that because I don't think the Conservatives dare try to do something like that either. I think, once again, as we've said before, because the Conservative Party is so split, they would have to probably rely on maybe Labour votes, especially something popular and actually good. They would have to rely on that. But of course, it depends what type of regulation they want to pass. And of course, as we said, even if this person is implementing something, costing 15 hours, he's being paid £15 an hour, and he has to spend 3 hours working to do it a year. But it depends, what is it he is implementing? Because if it's something like health and safety, when it comes to chemical regulations or even filling out the paperwork for exporting stuff to the EU, then you are actively saying that your Brexit, something you advocated for, isn't working, that is costing businesses money. And if you deregulate, then they're going to have to probably do even more paperwork to send to the EU. And because you have chosen not to say what you are implementing, I'm interpreting it as paperwork, the Brexit paperwork that a business would have to fill out. And this is why you see businesses just say, what's the point? Or we're going to scale back on exporting or stuff like that. And if you care about growth, then you should care about that businesses have given up on exporting. And that us being a importing country only, which a lot of these Brexiteers seem to think, actually probably isn't that good. Because you've got to, you can import, but you've got to be able to export as well as a country. Because again, that's what allow businesses to grow. That's what allow for growth in the economy. And again, that's what apparently this guy cares about, growth, but he's not really looking at the areas of where you can achieve growth, which says everything you need to know about these free market fundamentalists, as we said at the beginning. So, anyway, back to it. There are hundreds of regulations, many of which cost much more time and capital investment. Furthermore, it frees up time and enterprise for innovation and lifeblood of the economy. Again, that's already happened in the economy. This guy just denies that it's happening. Businesses will judge the government by its actions. With thousands of its officials in hand, it should not be impossible to drive through this program that was authorized by a small group on behalf of its network of entrepreneurs. And here's the thing. I love the first thing. An attempt at re-entry would be an attempt at entry would run into the harsh realities of the world that this required. Public sentiment would soon change. Again, quote from the article. The response was, "This is pure conjecture, as is much of the rest of the article." Oh, again, someone calling out, I believe that 40% of EU regulations are direct inputs or copies from the UK. In other words, we wanted and designed them for a productivity for our workforce and to improve the capability and ease of the world trade. The author mentions no regulations whatsoever, and he would like to repeal or increase our economic growth. But he's not alone. I've yet to read any single advantage of Brexit from the charlatans who promoted it. Oh, again, it's kind of interesting that you've got a lot of this again here. Again, something. Oh, I recommend you read the report for the business and network. Not one of its recommendations is on product standards. You might think that John Littleworth is the entire membership of the Independent Business Network, as thick as two short planks for not not realizing that in order to export a producer's products, must meet the standards of the importing country. Trade facilitation is the best advanced by recognition of equal individual standards and not enforcing the same standards on all. This is the approach of the WTO. Um, um, look, some. I don't think this is some. Why am I just try and find it? Here's a good one. Yeah. So why are Apple changing its products worldwide to comply with EU law? For example, it's replacing its Apple Conductor USB-C, even though the EU market is not the largest that it serves. It still makes sense to produce one version of its products to fit all EU regulation standards for sale, even to the whole world, in quirk inducing its domestic market and China. Um, Again, all these things that talking about this, and it's just fascinating that a lot of the Brexiteers seem to think, or at least under the labor under the opinion that people really care about getting rid of EU regulations, but that's not the case. We are a country who really does care about regulations, and we have not yet seen, as I thought we might see, a British government try and actually change them. Now, we did see Kersey Kotang, if you may remember, when he was business secretary, he floated the idea of getting rid of the EU Working Time Directive. He floated that idea, but there was such a backlash, he very quickly dropped it. And that is what we have seen mostly from these regulations. Whenever we see them floated, there's a massive backlash and they know it won't be popular, so it's very quickly dropped. And remember, you had people like Michael Gove, all these other Brexiteers saying, "Oh, don't worry about standards; they're not going to be lowered," because again, you had the people on the Remain side saying, "Hey, look, these people, if you listen to what they're saying, they want to go on a massive deregulatory bender," and then their response would be, "No, no, we're not. We're going to keep the same, if not have even a higher standard when we leave the EU." But that's not what all these Brexiteers are suddenly turning around saying. They're now saying, "Oh, we need to go on a massive deregulatory bender." And I think people are starting to realize that that's what they want to do. That will have big consequences because the EU's not going to sit there and say, "Oh yeah, you've done that deregulation, so um, tariffs on that product," or you have to now fill in more paperwork. Or you as a company have to prove that you are now complying with EU production manufacturing standards, even though because your country has now lowered those standards, which again implies more paperwork. So going back to the example, because again, he didn't say what what that £15 an hour worker would be doing. Well, maybe he's filling out paperwork to export to the EU. And now he has to spend 4 hours, maybe 5 hours, because again, that paperwork can be quite burdensome and cumbersome. Um, the idea that if we did something, there would be no consequences, no repercussions, and everything would just be great is the exact same thing that spawned Brexit. And we've got to be careful that this attitude around regulations does also not take root. But to be honest, I have seen many, many times Brexiteers try and float actual deregulation when they've actually said it, and they've had a lot of pushback. And in this article, again, at the comments, a lot of it is pushing back against the idea that deregulation would be a good thing. So very optimistic about that. But we'll see. But of course, as we said, the people who backed Liz Truss and backed her all crazy economic ideas, they're still out there. They're still in the Conservative Party. And as I said at the beginning, I think Liz Truss would have a very good platform to rerun and potentially make a comeback. It's not beyond the realms of possibility because those free market fundamentalists, they still walk amongst the Conservative Party. Even though, once again, their ideas almost crashed the UK. Well, it did crash the UK economy and almost destroyed the pensions industry in the UK. So always something worth bringing up when we're talking about Liz Truss. But as always, it's been another long one today. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, we'll see you all next time.